The wind screamed through the skeletal pines, its icy breath carving through the valley like a blade. Snow, thick and relentless, fell from an ashen sky, swallowing the landscape in a blinding white shroud. Every branch, every rock, every whisper of life lay entombed beneath winter's merciless grip. In the heart of this frozen wilderness, where silence reigned and the sun was a distant memory, a man stood utterly still, his breath shallow, his pulse thunderous. His name was Bryce Callahan, and though he had faced death in more ways than he could count, from the blistering sands of war to the sterile, cold corridors of hospital trauma units, nothing had prepared him for the sight before him now. A bear, but not just any bear. This was something raw, something primal, a towering grizzly, ribs jutting through a tapestry of matted fur, its massive frame reduced to a gaunt shadow of power. Blood, dark and sluggish, seeped from a ragged wound along its shoulder, staining the snow in an obscene contrast of life and death. Its breath came in shallow puffs, each exhale a struggle, each inhale a battle. But it was the eyes, those hollow, sunken eyes, that pierced Bryce's soul, pinning him where he stood. The bear should have charged, should have roared its warning, should have retreated into the trees to let nature, cruel and indifferent, decide its fate. But it did none of those things. It just stood there, trembling, desperate, broken. A sound low and shuddering escaped the creature's throat, a sound that did not belong to a predator, but to a mother stripped bare of strength, stripped bare of hope. It was a sound Bryce knew too well, the sound of pleading, of surrender, a sound he had heard from soldiers on the battlefield and from wounded animals alike, the universal voice of life, begging not to be forgotten. His fingers, numb within his gloves, instinctively tightened around the rifle slung across his chest. His training screamed at him, a wounded bear is a dead bear. And yet he didn't raise the weapon. Something ancient and wordless passed between them in that brutal, frozen air. A connection, pure and undiluted by reason. It wasn't fear he felt in the bear's gaze. It wasn't even anger. It was trust, fragile, unspoken, and it hit Bryce harder than any bullet ever could. The wind shifted and the bear staggered, its colossal frame collapsing to one knee with a thud that shook the earth. A weak growl, barely more than a whisper, escaped its jaws. Then a cough, wet and awful, painting the snow with red. Bryce felt his throat tighten, his chest ache. He had seen death. He had lived alongside it. But there was something about this death, this slow, merciless, lonely death, that felt wrong. The radio clip to his belt crackled faintly with the weather report. Blizzard conditions expected to worsen. Wind chill nearing -40. Stay indoors. No rescue operations until further notice. Bryce barely heard it. His focus was on the bear's trembling form, on the rise and fall of its labored chest, each breath a losing war against the cold. Every instinct, every survival manual, every hard-won rule screamed at him to walk away. This was nature's course, nature's law. But something deeper, something raw and human and painfully alive, screamed louder. What was survival if it meant watching something die alone in the snow, with nothing but the wind to witness its passing? His voice, barely a whisper against the storm, broke free. Hey, big fella." His breath clouded before him, carried off into the void. The bear's ear flicked a subtle, weakened acknowledgement. Bryce felt his heart crack. It was listening. It was listening. And it was waiting for something. A choice. The rifle felt impossibly heavy now, not from its steel, but from its meaning. Bryce lowered it, slowly, deliberately, until it hung useless at his side. His knees hit the snow, and he felt the cold seep instantly through his jeans, burning his skin. He didn't care. The bear, massive and broken, lifted its gaze to meet his, eyes clouded with pain, and something that made his chest tighten until he couldn't breathe. Understanding. And then, barely visible through the curtain of snow, the bear did something that shattered every wall around Bryce's heart. It leaned forward, its colossal head lowering slightly toward him, as if surrendering. Not in fear, not in defeat, in trust. The silence between them felt sacred, a heartbeat in the void, a connection older than time itself. And it was then that Bryce felt it. Something deeper than survival, something worth more than caution. His gloved hand, trembling, extended, not in challenge, but in compassion. "I'm here," he whispered, barely audible over the wind's mournful cry. "I've got you." The bear's breath, weak and shallow, puffed against his outstretched palm. The warmth of it, fragile, fleeting, seared Bryce's soul more deeply than any fire ever could. There are moments in life when the universe holds its breath, when the fragile line between life and death, between man and beast, blurs into something sacred. This was such a moment. If you believe in the power of stories that connect us to the wild, to the raw, untamed beauty of life, and the creatures we share this world with, make sure you don't miss more like this. Subscribe to Wilderness Untold and become part of a community that honors these moments, the ones that remind us what it means to be truly human. The wind screamed on, but Bryce no longer heard it. His world had narrowed to the rise and fall of the bear's chest, to the impossible, fragile warmth of life that flickered within it. He knew the risks. He knew the cost. But some things in life, some choices, are made not with the mind, but with the heart. And his heart, though scarred and worn, had already decided. Because some lives are worth saving, even if they aren't human. The bear's eyes fluttered, and for a breathless second, Bryce feared he was too late. But then, a flicker, weak, trembling. But there, the bear's head shifted, and it let out a sound, not a growl, not a snarl, but something soft, something grateful. And in that instant, Bryce knew this was only the beginning. What happens when compassion defies every rule of survival? And what price will Bryce pay for choosing empathy over instinct? The wilderness doesn't forgive mistakes, and something in the shadows is watching. The storm had not relented. Wind clawed at the windows with icy fingers, howling through the cracks of the old cabin, as if trying to drag the warmth from within and smother it in the endless, white abyss outside. The world beyond the glass had become a shapeless void, a merciless canvas of snow and shadow where life had no place. Inside, the air was thick with the crackling warmth of a fire and something far more fragile, the delicate, flickering thread between life and death. Bryce Callahan stood motionless, his breath heavy, his pulse a frantic drumbeat in his ears. The rifle, once a sentinel in his hands, now lay discarded against the wall. In its place, his gloved hands, stained with earth and blood, trembled against the coarse fur of the creature he had sworn never to touch. The bear, Atlas, lay stretched across the rough wooden floor, his massive frame barely rising with each shallow breath. The heat of his body, where it touched Bryce's knees, was faint and growing colder by the second. The smell of copper was in the air, thick and unmistakable. The bleeding had slowed but not stopped, the gash along Atlas's shoulder a cruel, jagged testament to the violence of this wilderness. Bryce's hands pressed against the wound, his body rigid with the effort to keep pressure steady. His knees ached from the cold seeping through his jeans, but he didn't move, couldn't. The moment felt impossibly fragile, as if the slightest shift would tip Atlas over the edge. "Come on, big guy," Bryce muttered, his voice hoarse and raw, barely more than a whisper against a roar of the wind. "Stay with me." The bear's eye, the one not glazed with exhaustion, flickered open. It found Bryce, dull and heavy, but still aware, still trusting. A lump formed in Bryce's throat, his chest tightening until he could barely breathe. What was this? This connection that burned so fiercely it threatened to consume him whole. He felt his stomach twist, not from fear, but from something far worse. From helplessness. It was a feeling he knew too well. He had felt it in the field, watching friends bleed out in places where no help would come. He had felt it in the sterile chill of a hospital room, as machines screamed their flat, final notes. And now here, with a creature he should fear but could not, would not abandon. Atlas's breath hitched, a wet, rattling sound, and Bryce felt panic rise, cold and sharp, in his chest. His fingers, stiff and numb, fumbled for the gauze in the first aid kit beside him. The bandages were too small, too thin for a creature of this size, like trying to stop a flood with a handful of leaves. His hands shook as he pressed them against the wound, and his voice cracked, the weight of it too much to bear. "You're not dying here," he said, his voice shaking. "Not like this. Not now." The fire popped, the logs cracking beneath the heat, and for a moment the room felt too small, too suffocating. Bryce's chest heaved, his throat burning. He felt his vision blur. No, he bit down hard on the grief threatening to break him. Not now. Not yet. The bear's eye closed, and for a breathless second, Bryce thought, no. But then a slow, labored breath escaped Atlas's massive chest. Bryce's hands, slick and shaking, pressed harder, fighting a battle that felt already lost. A sudden gust rattled the windows, and for a moment, the howling outside felt like a voice, like 1,000 voices, mocking his desperation. Bryce's head dropped, his forehead nearly touching Atlas's fur. The warmth there was faint, too faint. The silence stretched, and the cold gnawed at the edges of the world. And in that silence, Bryce did something he hadn't done in years. He whispered, "Please." The word, cracked and broken, hung in the air. He didn't know to whom he spoke. God, the earth, the bear himself. But escaped him, raw and naked, pulled from the deepest, most hollow part of his chest. "Please." The bear stirred. A twitch, barely a movement, but it was there. And suddenly, Bryce was moving again, his hands working with new, reckless urgency. His jacket, torn and worn, became a makeshift compress. The last of his alcohol, meant for his wounds, he poured into the bear's. The creature flinched, and Bryce's hand found the side of Atlas's massive neck, his voice low, soothing, trembling. I know. I'm sorry." Outside, the storm screamed on. The world was ice and shadow and death. But inside this cabin, there was something that the cold could not touch, a fight older than instinct, older than reason, a fight to save something that was not his to save, because some lives are worth the fight. If you've ever felt the raw, unspoken bond between human and nature, the kind that defies logic and reason, then you know how moments like this change you forever. And if you believe these stories matter, if they stir something ancient and true in you, then join us at Wilderness Untold, where the wild and the human heart collide in stories that leave a mark. The minutes stretched into eternity, and Bryce's body ached, but he didn't stop, not until his strength was gone, not until the shaking in his hands became too great to control. And then, at last, he slumped forward, his breath heaving, his forehead resting against the bear's heaving side. Atlas's breath, still weak, still shallow, but there. Bryce's eyes squeezed shut, and something hot and painful slipped free, a single tear, lost against the bear's fur. "You're still here," he whispered, his voice breaking. Good. The fire crackled on. The storm raged. And somewhere in the dark, someone was watching. But the battle for life, for trust, for something more than survival, it had only just begun. The cabin was steeped in a heavy, fragile stillness, broken only by the low, labored breaths that came from the massive creature lying on the floor. The fire had burned low, casting a faint amber glow that flickered weakly across the rough wooden walls, illuminating the tableau of man and beast, both bruised, both breathless, both on the edge of something irreversible. The smell of blood and earth hung in the air, blending with the smoky warmth of burning pine, a scent that carried the raw weight of life and death intertwined. Bryce Callahan knelt beside the bear, Atlas, his hands raw, his body trembling with exhaustion. The makeshift bandages, layers of his own torn flannel and gauze, pressed against the bear's side, already soaked through with blood. His fingertips, still pressed into the coarse, warm fur, felt the faint tremor of a heartbeat. Thin, fluttering, but there. Still there. He had fought, harder than he ever had. Not with bullets or blades, but with his own hands, his own breath, his own desperate refusal to let life slip away. Atlas's great chest rose and fell unevenly, and with every shallow gasp, Bryce felt the thread of hope in his chest strain, fraying beneath the weight of doubt. He wanted to believe, needed to believe, that his intervention had mattered. But as he watched the bear's eye, half-lidded and dulled by agony, he felt the sharp ache of something he couldn't name, a sorrow too big to hold, too bitter to swallow. His voice, raw and cracked from the cold and from pleading, barely made a sound. "I don't know if you can hear me," he rasped, his throat tight with emotion. "But you're not alone. You're not dying alone." The bear's ear flicked, the smallest acknowledgement, but Bryce felt it as if it were a scream, because in the vast silence of this moment, the smallest thing meant everything. Outside, the wind slammed against the cabin, the storm still howling with a fury that felt alive, like the wilderness itself was testing them, daring them to hold on, daring them to break. The windows rattled, and every draft that found its way inside sliced through Bryce's sweat-soaked shirt, chilling him to the bone. But he didn't move from Atlas's side. He couldn't. The bear shuddered suddenly, a ripple of pain that pulled a weak, low rumble from its chest, a sound that was not aggression, but suffering. Bryce's body tightened instinctively, his heart wrenching at the rawness of it. His hand moved without thought, finding the space just behind Atlas's massive ear, his fingers brushing through the thick, coarse fur, clumsy, cautious, human. The bear didn't flinch, didn't pull away. That touch, so simple, so impossible, cracked something open in Bryce, something he hadn't known was still capable of breaking. His voice, thick with something he fought to contain, slipped out before he could stop it. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so damn sorry. For the pain, for the cruelty of this world, for every bullet, every trap, every human act that had brought this magnificent creature to the edge of death." Atlas's body trembled under his touch, and for a terrifying moment, Bryce felt the great bear's breathing slow, too slow. Panic surged, raw and bright. "No," he snapped, his voice breaking. "No, you don't get to give up. Not now. You fought this long. You fought." His hands moved frantically, pressing the bandages tighter, trying to force life back into the body before him. "Come on, you stubborn bastard," he growled, his voice shaking. "Don't you leave me here." The silence stretched and stretched until it felt like something had shattered in the air. Then a breath. Slow, ragged, but there. Bryce's chest caved, his breath escaping in a harsh, shuddering exhale. His head dropped, his forehead resting briefly against the bear's side, and his eyes, burning, raw, squeezed shut. Relief and anguish, so tightly wound, crashed through him, leaving him shaking. "Good," he whispered, his voice barely more than air. "Good boy." The fire popped, sending a spark onto the stone hearth, and the sound brought Bryce back to the room, back to the reality of their fragile survival. His body screamed with exhaustion, his muscles locking from cold and strain. But the battle wasn't over. The bear needed warmth, needed more than Bryce could give with shaking hands and hope alone. His eyes flicked toward the woodpile, dwindling. Not enough to keep the fire alive through the night. His stomach twisted. If the fire died, Atlas wouldn't last. And neither, probably, would he. The storm outside was a wall of white death, the kind of cold that could flay skin from bone and turn breath to ice. But Bryce had faced worse enemies. Fear wasn't what gripped him now. It was something else, something more painful. What if it's not enough? He found himself whispering to the still form beside him, his voice thick and low. "I don't know why you came to me," he said softly, "but I won't let you leave this world alone." The bear's eye, cracked open and glassy, found him, and in it, something Bryce felt more than saw: trust. A silence passed, heavy and pure, and Bryce's heart clenched so hard it felt like breaking. If you believe that life, every life, deserves a fight, if you've ever felt the power of moments that strip you down to what truly matters, then don't miss stories like this. Subscribe to Wilderness Untold, where the wild and the human heart collide in ways you'll never forget. The wind screamed on, but Bryce was already on his feet, his body moving through exhaustion and cold, his decision made before his mind had caught up. He threw on his coat, wet, stiff, and cold from earlier, and yanked open the door. The storm hit him like a freight train, wind and snow driving against him, trying to force him back inside. But Bryce had fought wars, both with men and with himself. A blizzard wasn't going to stop him. The trees were a blur of shadows, barely visible through the white fury, and each step felt like wading through cement. His boots crunched through ice-crusted snow, his breath burning his throat with every exhale. The cold gnawed at his skin, at his bones, but he kept going, fighting against the wind, against the screaming in his own body to turn back. His fingers, stiff and frozen, found the next log and the next, until his arms were full and his chest burned from the effort. The return to the cabin felt longer, an eternity carved out of ice and agony. His legs threatened to buckle, his lungs clawing for air. But when he finally stumbled through the door, the warmth, faint, barely more than a whisper, greeted him like an embrace. He collapsed, the logs scattering at his feet, his body trembling violently. But his eyes found the bear, and the sound that came from him was raw, primal, a mixture of pain and triumph. "I got you," he gasped. "I got you." The fire grew, licking greedily at the new wood, and warmth crept back into the room, slow but certain. Bryce's shaking hand found Atlas's neck, feeling for that thread of life. Still there, weak, but there. His head dropped against the bear's side, his breath finally slowing, his body surrendering to the exhaustion he could no longer fight. And in the flickering light, man and beast lay together, two survivors, two hearts, two lives clinging to the edge of something neither could name. But the night wasn't over, and something in the dark was still watching and waiting. The snow had softened to a whisper, but the cold remained, an unforgiving, razor-edged presence that seeped into every crack, every breath, every heartbeat. The world beyond the cabin was a vast, frozen canvas, where trees stood as skeletal sentinels, their limbs bowed under the crushing weight of winter. The storm had passed, but in its wake, a deeper silence remained, the kind that only comes when something has been broken. Inside, the air was thick, not with warmth, but with something raw and wordless. The fire, though stoked, seemed feeble, its glow failing to chase the shadows that clung to the walls. Bryce Callahan sat against the edge of the rough wooden floor, his back pressed to the cold stone of the hearth. His body was taut with exhaustion, every muscle screaming, his hands trembling from strain and something far worse, something that gnawed from within, colder than any winter. The bear, Atlas, lay motionless before him. His massive frame rose and fell in a slow, unsteady rhythm, each breath dragging from his chest like a battle he was losing. The bandages, Bryce's flannel, his last strips of cloth, anything he could tear from himself, clung to the bear's wounds, stained through with blood. And still, it wasn't enough. The heat from Atlas's body had dwindled. His ears no longer flicked at the sounds of the fire. His eyes, when they opened, were clouded, distant, and unfocused. Bryce's throat burned with the weight of everything he couldn't say. His voice, when it came, was rough and low, barely more than a crack in the quiet. "I don't know what else to do." The admission slipped from his lips like something stolen, something that cost too much to surrender. He hated those words, hated them. He had fought, on battlefields, in emergency rooms, through nights where hope had been nothing but a whisper in the dark, and he had always found a way to fight back. But now, his voice broke. "I'm losing you." The bear's eye fluttered, just barely. And for a heartbeat, Bryce felt something that hit him with the force of grief, because it was recognition. Atlas knew he was there, knew who was there. The trust in that single, flickering gaze was a blade to the chest. Bryce's body shook as he pressed his hands against the bear's side again, not to stop the bleeding. There was nothing left to stop, but to feel that heartbeat, that fragile, failing thread of life. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice cracking. "You should be out there." His voice rose, trembling raw. "Not dying on this damn floor." His hand gripped the thick fur, clenching until his knuckles blanched. "You fought to live," he said hoarsely. "You fought. And I." His voice fractured. "I don't know how to help you anymore." The silence pressed against him, and his chest caved beneath it. He felt his throat close, his eyes burning, because he knew this feeling, this helplessness, this loss. He had felt it kneeling beside fallen soldiers, their blood staining his hands. He had felt it in a hospital corridor, with sterile walls and the sound of a flatline that no amount of pleading could silence. But this was worse, because it was not supposed to happen here. Not like this. Not when they had fought so hard. The bear's breath hitched, a sudden, shallow gasp. Bryce froze, his body tensing, his heart seizing. "No," he whispered, terror lacing through the word. His hand pressed harder against the bear's ribs, feeling for that precious, fragile movement of life. Nothing. Atlas's chest, still. "No." Bryce choked. No. The world tilted, everything inside him collapsing at once. His hand shot to the bear's great muzzle, his voice breaking as he called into the silence. "Don't." His voice shattered. "Don't you leave me." The sound that escaped him wasn't a word. It was loss, raw and bleeding. His body folded over Atlas's, his forehead pressing into the cold, matted fur. "Please," he whispered, his voice wrecked, a prayer ripped from something deeper than his soul. "Don't leave me here." The silence answered. The fire crackled. The world stopped. And then a breath. Faint, shuddering, but a breath. Bryce's head snapped up, his heart slamming against his ribs. He froze, his body stiff with disbelief. His eyes found the bear's side, and there, it rose. Barely, but rose. Atlas gasped again, a wet, ragged struggle, but struggle. His body convulsed, and Bryce's hands flew instinctively to his head, his touch trembling. "You're still here," he breathed, his voice raw, shaking. "You're." His throat closed, and his head dropped again, his forehead pressing into Atlas's, as if he could somehow will the life into him. "Stay," he begged, his voice breaking against the coarse fur. "Stay with me." Because some lives you don't let go of. If you've ever felt the fight for something bigger than yourself, the kind that tears you open and leaves you changed, then you know how stories like these aren't just stories. They're reminders of what it means to care. Be part of those stories. Join us at Wilderness Untold and never miss the moments that matter. The minutes stretched into hours. Bryce did not move from Atlas's side. He could hear the bear's breath, faint and shallow, and with every gasp, a sliver of his hope returned, fragile and flickering, but there. But something else gnawed at him, something cold that wasn't from the storm. The bear's wounds, they weren't from nature. They weren't the work of winter. They were the work of something else. And somewhere beyond the trees, where the storm had covered every track, every trace, something watched and waited. The battle for survival wasn't over. It had only just begun. The air outside was razor-sharp, each breath a dagger to the lungs, but Bryce Callahan barely felt it. His legs burned as he pushed through the snow, each step a battle against the earth that tried to swallow him whole. The storm had passed, but the sky still hung heavy with an oppressive gray, and the wind hissed through the skeletal trees, a warning, or perhaps a whisper of what lay ahead. The wilderness was alive around him, but it was not the roar of nature that quickened his heart. It was something else. Atlas was leading him. The bear's massive form, still weakened from his wounds, lumbered ahead through the snowdrifts. His steps were slow, deliberate, but there was a purpose to them, a direction that felt like instinct. Bryce followed without question. He didn't know how he understood, only that he did. The bear wanted him to come, needed him to come. The forest thickened around them, the trees pressing close like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with ice. Every crunch of snow beneath their steps felt too loud, a violation of the solemnity that cloaked this place. The air was colder here, not the cold winter, but something deeper, something that made the bones ache and the heart shrink. Bryce felt it settle on his skin, and he fought the rising dread curling in his chest. Then he heard it, a sound distant but unmistakable, a cry, small, desperate, and so heartbreakingly alone. His breath caught, and he felt his body tense, his pulse suddenly pounding in his ears. His eyes snapped to Atlas, whose ears had already pricked toward the sound. The bear's body went still, every muscle coiled with something Bryce recognized instantly, not fear, grief. The bear began to move again, faster now, urgency driving his wounded frame forward. Bryce followed, his boots digging hard into the snow, his lungs burning with every breath. The cries grew louder with each step, thin, helpless mules that cut through the air like broken glass. Something inside Bryce twisted tight, a knot of cold and sorrow that was almost too much to bear. And then, they found it. The clearing was small, swallowed by snow and shadow, but it was what lay at its heart that made Bryce's stomach drop. A small bear cub, barely more than a bundle of fur, lay half buried in the snow, its body heaving with shallow, labored breaths. One tiny paw twitched feebly, the pads torn and bloodied from what must have been a desperate, impossible struggle. Bryce's chest tightened, the air seizing in his throat. The cub's cries, raw and weakening, weren't just sounds. They were pleas, and they hit him like a fist to the ribs, cracking something deep inside. Atlas's reaction was instant. A low, mournful rumble escaped him, a sound so full of anguish that it stripped the warmth from the air. The bear moved forward, his body trembling from more than cold, and lowered his massive head to the tiny form. His muzzle nudged the cub, gently, so gently, a touch that said more than words ever could. But the cub didn't respond. Bryce felt something hot and sharp sting his eyes, a burn that had nothing to do with the wind. His knees hit the snow beside them, his hands already reaching out. His voice, rough and tight, barely made it past his lips. "Hey, hey, little one, I'm here." The cub's ear flicked, a faint, broken movement, and Bryce's chest cracked wide open. He could feel the cold of the little body beneath his fingers, the heartbeat weak and flickering, so close to being lost. His breath shook as he pulled off his gloves, his bare hands raw and red as he cupped the tiny form. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You're not alone." Atlas's breath, heavy and ragged, brushed against Bryce's shoulder. The bear's eyes, dark, endless pools, locked with his, and Bryce felt the weight of something ancient and primal pass between them. "Save my child." Bryce's heart slammed. "I'll try," he whispered, the words a vow. "I swear." But the cub was so cold, too cold. Bryce's hands moved with the urgency of a man drowning, his fingers working to brush snow from the little mouth, clearing the airway. "Come on, baby," he murmured, his voice thick with pleading. "Come back to me." The cub's body seized, a sudden, small gasp. Bryce's heart leapt, his own breath catching as he felt the faintest flutter of warmth against his palm. "That's it," he choked. "That's it, stay with me." His body folded instinctively, sheltering the cub from the wind, his own breath warming its face. The cub's eyes cracked open, tiny, dark, and distant. Bryce felt his throat tighten painfully because he knew that look. It was the look of a soul on the edge, teetering between staying and slipping into the dark. "Don't give up," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Not yet." Atlas, his massive frame looming beside them, lowered his great head to the tiny cub. A soft, mournful sound escaped his chest, a sound that carried with it every ounce of a father's agony. Bryce felt something inside him break wide open. This wasn't just nature. This wasn't predator and prey, or instinct and survival. This was love, and it hurt. God, it hurt. If this moment stirs something in you, a connection to the raw, fragile bond between life, survival, and the wild, then join us at Wilderness Untold. Because these stories, these moments, matter. The cub's breath was shallow, but it was there. And Bryce, his heart pounding with something close to prayer, pulled his own jacket from his body, wrapping the tiny creature in its warmth. "Come on," he urged softly. "Stay with your dad. You're almost there." The minutes bled into eternity. Bryce felt his own body shaking, half from cold, half from the unbearable, impossible weight of hope. Atlas remained close, his massive body a shield against the wind, his eyes never leaving his child. Bryce felt the tears freeze on his cheeks, his throat tight with something raw and sacred. And then it happened. A sound, soft, so small it was almost lost in the wind. The cub, a weak, fragile whimper. Bryce's heart broke open, his breath escaping in a choked gasp. His hand, trembling, stroked over the tiny head, and he felt the warmth, the life, returning, inch by inch. He turned to Atlas, his voice barely a whisper. "He's here. He's still here." Atlas's body lowered, his massive frame curling protectively around them both, his breath washing over his child, a warmth more powerful than the fire of any hearth. His great eye closed, and a low, soft rumble vibrated through the earth. It was relief. It was gratitude. It was love. Bryce's head dropped, his body sagging with exhaustion, and something deeper, something like grace. His voice, cracked and raw, barely escaped his lips. "You did good," he whispered. "You did so good." The snow fell soft around them, a hush over the world, witness to something rare, something holy. But the woods were not empty. And somewhere unseen but not far, something was watching, something that did not belong. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The snow had long since stopped falling, but the cold remained, heavy, merciless, seeping into the earth, into the bones of everything that dared to survive. The wilderness stood in eerie silence, the kind that settled deep in the gut and warned of something unseen, something waiting. Bryce Callahan had felt this kind of quiet before, on battlefields where the air itself fell wrong, in hospital corridors where the beeping of machines had just flatlined, in places where death lingered before it struck. And now, he felt it here. Atlas had felt it too. The bear, still weak from his wounds, stood stiff beside him, his massive head lifted, nostrils flaring as he tasted the air. His eyes, dark and ancient, scanned the tree line ahead, his breath slow and measured. His cub, small, fragile, barely recovered, pressed against his father's massive frame, his tiny body shivering, though Bryce knew it wasn't from the cold. Something was watching them. Bryce gripped his rifle, not raised, not yet. His pulse pounded against his ribs, but his breath remained steady, controlled. Every sense in him screamed, but he waited. He listened. The wind shifted, and then a sound, a crack, not the natural groan of ice or the weight of snow collapsing from a branch. This was different. This was calculated, deliberate, human. The realization sent a shock of rage through Bryce, burning through the cold like fire in his veins. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch the way Atlas's ears had pinned back, his muscles coiled in tight restraint. The bear knew. He knew. Bryce's stomach twisted. The wounds on Atlas's body, the gunshot, the deep gash across his shoulder, hadn't come from the wilderness. They hadn't come from another animal. They had come from men. And now those men were back. A shadow shifted between the trees, barely there, gone in an instant, but Bryce saw it. His fingers tightened around the rifle stock, but he didn't move. Not yet. He forced himself to slow his breathing, to think, to feel the terrain beneath him. Every instinct he had ever honed whispered the same truth. They weren't alone. Atlas let out a low, guttural sound. Not quite a growl, but something close. His massive form tensed, his breathing deep and deliberate. He was waiting. Bryce could feel it. The cub let out a soft, terrified whimper and curled tighter against his father's leg. Bryce's throat clenched. He knew what was coming, and he knew, without a doubt, that whatever happened next would not be in his control. A voice shattered the silence. Callahan. The name rang through the trees, sharp and taunting, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Bryce's jaw tightened. He knew that voice. Garrison. Cold. Merciless. A hunter who didn't hunt for food, but for dominance. The kind of man who didn't see the wilderness as something to respect, but as something to conquer. Bryce turned, his eyes locking onto the dark figure standing just beyond the clearing. He was tall, wrapped in heavy furs, his rifle slung lazily over one shoulder like he had no reason to rush. And behind him, half shrouded in the trees, two others lingered, silent, waiting. 3 men, 3 rifles. Bryce's grip on his own rifle remained steady, but his gut coiled with rage. "You've got no business here," he called back, his voice even, betraying nothing. Garrison smirked, taking another slow step forward, his boots crunching against the ice. "I think you know that ain't true." His gaze flicked to Atlas, wounded, breathing heavy, but still standing. Then lower, to the cub, trembling in the snow. His smirk deepened. Didn't think he'd still be kicking. Tough bastard. Bryce's stomach churned. Atlas let out another low, rumbling noise, his muscles shifting like a coiled spring. The bear's dark gaze locked onto the men, but he didn't move. Not yet. Garrison exhaled, his breath fogging in the air. "You know how this works, Callahan. That's our bear." Bryce's teeth clenched. "He's not yours. He never was." Garrison tilted his head slightly, considering. Then, with a slow, calculated motion, he unslung his rifle. Not aimed. Just there. A reminder. Atlas moved then, just slightly. A shift in weight, a subtle turn of his head. Not aggressive, just watching. And for the first time, Bryce realized what was truly happening. This wasn't a hunt. It was a test. Atlas knew these men. He knew what they were capable of. And he was waiting. Not for them. Not for an attack. For Bryce. Because this wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was trust. Bryce's chest tightened. Garrison let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Look, Callahan, I don't got time for some moral debate. You got 2 choices. Step aside, or get buried in the snow with them." The wind howled. Bryce inhaled slowly. Then, he made his choice. His rifle, smooth and controlled, lifted to his shoulder. And for the first time in his life, he was standing with the bear. Not against it. Not as a man watching nature from the outside. As something else. Something wilder. Atlas moved beside him, a slow, deliberate shift. His massive form pressed forward, his breath deep and steady. His cub, small but not broken, lifted its head and watched. Garrison's smile faded. The moment stretched, an eternity carved into the snow. Bryce's voice, low and unwavering, cut through the cold. "You want them." His finger rested against the trigger. "Come take them." The silence that followed was different, thicker. The kind that only comes when something primal and ancient stirs beneath the surface. Garrison saw it then. Saw the way Bryce stood. Saw the way the bear waited. And for the first time, he hesitated. The wilderness does not belong to those who take. It belongs to those who fight for it. If you believe in the untamed power of the wild, in the stories that remind us who we are, then join us at Wilderness Untold. Because this world, these stories, are more than words. They are alive. The men did not move. The moment hung. And then, In a slow, measured motion, Garrison's rifle lowered. A decision, a retreat, but not an end. The men stepped back, fading into the trees, swallowed by the cold. Bryce let out a slow, shaky breath. Atlas exhaled, his breath curling into the air like smoke from a dying fire. The cub, small but unbroken, pressed closer to his father's leg. The fight was not over. Not yet. And Bryce knew. This was only the beginning. The forest was breathing. It wasn't the soft, peaceful sigh of trees swaying in a gentle wind or the whisper of leaves brushing together. It was something deeper, heavier. A breath filled with tension, raw, electric, and alive. The kind that presses against your skin, warning you that the earth itself is holding still, waiting for something to break. Bryce Callahan felt it. He felt it in his chest, in his pulse, in every instinct that screamed from the marrow of his bones. His breath came slow and steady, but his heart pounded like a war drum, loud in his ears. The rifle in his hands felt cold, but it wasn't the weapon that anchored him. It was Atlas. The bear stood beside him, his massive frame like a mountain of muscle and fur, his breath visible in great, steaming clouds. His eyes, dark, ancient, burning, were fixed on the trees ahead. His ears twitched, his nostrils flared, and Bryce could feel it, the tightening of every sinew, every muscle coiling like a spring. The cub, small and fragile, pressed close to his father's leg, his tiny body trembling, his wide eyes darting between the trees. Bryce's stomach clenched. They weren't alone. The first crack, soft, deliberate, slipped through the trees. A footstep, heavy, measured, the sound of something human. But it wasn't just the noise that sent Bryce's pulse racing. It was the silence that followed it. The kind of silence that only comes when something is hunting. Bryce's fingers flexed on the rifle, but he didn't raise it. Not yet. His body felt carved from stone, his muscles screaming to move, to fight. But he waited, because Atlas waited, and he had learned that the bear's instincts were sharper than his own. Then came the voice, low, sharp, cutting through the trees like a blade. "I know you're there, Callahan." Bryce's teeth clenched. "Garrison." The man's voice was slow, almost amused, but Bryce could hear the venom underneath it. The promise of something cold and unforgiving. "You think you're protecting something," Garrison continued, his voice slipping between the trees like a snake. "But you're not. You're just delaying the inevitable." A shadow moved, then another, two, maybe three. Bryce's pulse spiked. Atlas growled, a low, rolling thunder that vibrated through the earth. The cub whimpered, pressing tighter to his father, and Bryce felt something sharp twist in his chest. His fingers itched on the trigger, but he waited, because this wasn't about bullets. This was about something far older, far deeper. This was about trust. The wind shifted. Then, a sudden crack, a gunshot. The ground erupted beside Bryce's foot, snow spraying into the air. His body jolted, his ears ringing from the blast. The cub let out a terrified cry, and Atlas, God, Atlas, roared. A sound that shook the sky and burned through the marrow of the trees. Bryce's voice, raw and furious, ripped from his throat. "Stop." And for a second, just a second, the forest froze. The air itself seemed to shudder with the echo of Atlas's rage. But in the aftermath of that sound, Bryce felt something worse. Movement. Atlas shifted. Fast, too fast for his weakened body. And Bryce's gut turned to ice because he knew. The bear was going to charge, to protect, and it would kill him. Because Atlas wasn't what he had been. His body, still broken from wounds not yet healed, would never outrun bullets. His strength, immense but fading, would never outlast rifles. Bryce moved without thinking. "No and no," he yelled, his voice ripping from his chest as his body threw itself between the bear and the trees. The sudden shift stopped Atlas cold. The bear's massive frame loomed over him, his breath hot and ragged, his muscles shaking with fury barely restrained. But his eyes, Those dark, wounded eyes locked on Bryce's, and Bryce felt the weight of everything in them. The pain, the instinct, the fear. Not for himself, for the cub. Bryce's voice, raw and desperate, shook. No, you stay. You stay with him. His chest heaved. They want you to fight, but that's not how this ends. The bear didn't move, but Bryce felt the tremor in the earth, where Atlas's claws dug deep. A voice, Garrison's, shattered the silence again. You're a damn fool, Callahan. Bryce's heart pounded, his rifle still low, his body an open target. Maybe, he called back, his voice cutting through the cold. But I'm not the one who's afraid. The trees shifted, and from them, the shadows emerged. 3 figures, Garrison in front, the other 2 flanking, rifles raised. Their faces were cold, their eyes hard, but Garrison was grinning. Step aside, he said softly. That's all you have to do. Bryce's voice, low and shaking with something deeper than anger, cut through the space between them. I don't move for cowards. The forest waited. Atlas's breath, hot and steady, rumbled behind Bryce. The cub, small, fragile, whimpered softly. Bryce's voice, tight and raw, dropped to something only the bear could hear. I know you want to fight. His throat burned. But if you go down there, he'll be alone. The words cracked in his chest, because they weren't just for Atlas. They were for himself. Because he knew what it was to lose the one thing that made the world make sense. To be left in the wreckage with nothing but the echo of a heartbeat that wasn't there anymore. Atlas's breath hitched, and for one soul-breaking second, Bryce saw something in the bear's eyes that shattered him. Pain. Not from his wounds, but from the choice, to fight or to stay. And then, slowly, Atlas moved, not forward, but back. His massive body shifted, curling over the cub, his frame a shield. His head lowered, his breath warm and heavy, his body trembling. But he did not charge. And Bryce, felt his throat close because he understood. Atlas wasn't surrendering. He was choosing, because some things, some lives, are worth more than vengeance. If you've ever felt that, if you've ever known what it means to fight not with your fists, but with your heart, then you understand why stories like these matter. They remind us who we are. Don't miss them. Subscribe to Wilderness Untold, because some stories need to be told. The silence broke. Wrong choice. Garrison hissed. The gun rose. Bryce moved. The shot cracked, but something else moved first. The cub, the small body, frail but alive, darted into the open, its tiny voice crying out, not in fear, but in defiance. The shot missed wide, and the sound, that sound, froze the world, because it wasn't just a sound, it was life, the smallest voice, but the loudest cry. And in that frozen, impossible second, the world shifted. Because Garrison saw it, and for the first time, he hesitated. Atlas's roar, earth-shattering and primal, erupted through the trees, not with rage, but with something greater, a father's fury, a protector's vow, and the world itself seemed to hold its breath, because something had changed. The battle wasn't over, but something far greater had begun. The world was stripped to silence. Not the kind of silence that brought peace. Not the kind that came with a soft snowfall, where the earth rested beneath a blanket of white. This silence was heavier, suffocating, filled with the weight of what had just happened, of what was still happening. It clung to the air, thick and stifling, pressing against Bryce Callahan's chest like a hand squeezing the breath from his lungs. His fingers twitched against the stock of his rifle, but he didn't lift it. Not yet. His breath fogged in the frigid air, sharp and shallow, but his heart was a war drum, pounding inside his ribs with the force of something ancient, something primal. Atlas was still. The massive bear stood beside him, his breath slow, heavy, misting into the cold. His body was rigid, every muscle locked in place, his eyes dark and sharp, staring ahead, staring at them. Garrison and his men. The 3 hunters hadn't moved since the last gunshot, a shot that had not found its target. The moment had stretched, frozen in time, the weight of it crushing. But now the ice was cracking. Bryce could feel it. The tension was shifting, and something was about to break. The wind cut low through the valley, carrying with it the scent of pine, of blood, of something colder than winter. The cub, the tiny, trembling life caught between giants, let out the smallest sound, a cry, fragile, frightened. And that was when Atlas moved, not in rage, not in fear, but in warning. His body shifted, his massive frame turning just enough to shield his child, his presence casting a shadow over the little form curled in the snow. His breath rumbled through his chest, not yet a growl, not yet a roar, just a sound that made the air itself tighten, made the trees seem to hold their breath. Bryce saw it, and so did Garrison. The man's grip on his rifle flexed, his jaw tightening, the smirk that had once curled at the corner of his lips now gone. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those cold, predatory eyes, were still locked on the bear, calculating. Wait, Bryce knew that look. It was the look of a man deciding whether to pull a trigger. And Bryce knew. He knew. If that gun was raised again, if that decision was made, there would be no stopping what came next. Atlas would fight. Atlas would die. And the cub, Bryce's chest clenched. The cub would be left alone. Alone in the vast, merciless winter. Alone in a world that did not forgive. Bryce's breath hitched. He had seen that before, had felt it before. That kind of emptiness, that kind of loss. And he would not let it happen again. His voice, rough and raw, slipped through the cold. Enough. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a command. It was something final. Garrison's head turned slightly, his eyes cutting toward Bryce, slow and measured, like he was only just remembering that another man stood there. His lips pressed together, his fingers twitching against his rifle. But he didn't raise it. Not yet. Bryce took a step forward. Atlas didn't stop him. The cub pressed itself further against its father's leg. But Atlas let him go. That trust, that fragile, unspoken thing that had been forged in the fire of everything they had endured, settled deep into Bryce's chest. He didn't look at the bear, didn't look at the cub. He kept his focus on Garrison, on the threat. Bryce's voice was steady. Low. This isn't your fight anymore. Garrison's expression darkened. That's so. Bryce didn't blink. Yeah, it is. The wind howled. Garrison exhaled slowly, then took a step forward of his own. The distance between them was now nothing. And for the first time, Bryce saw it. The shift in Garrison's eyes. Something uncertain. Something that wasn't there before. Garrison had expected a fight. He had wanted it. But this was different. This was something he didn't understand. Because Bryce wasn't standing in fear. Bryce was standing in defiance. Not alone. Not as a man protecting something weak. But as something greater. As something willing to give everything. Bryce let the silence hang between them for a moment longer. Then said, "Go." The muscles in Garrison's jaw twitched. Then, slowly, he lifted his rifle. Not toward Atlas. Not toward the cub, but away. He slung it back over his shoulder, his lips curling in something that wasn't quite a smirk. But it wasn't quite defeat either. He studied Bryce for a long, tense moment, then let out a breath, that fog between them. "This isn't over," he murmured. Bryce's chest burned, but his voice remained even. "No, it isn't." Garrison's tongue flicked across his teeth then. Without another word, he turned. The other 2 men hesitated, lingering a second longer, but then they followed. And just like that, they were gone, swallowed by the trees, swallowed by the silence. Bryce's body didn't relax. Not yet. Not even when the last shadow of them disappeared into the wilderness, leaving nothing but their tracks. Not even when the wind carried away the tension, leaving behind only cold. It wasn't until he felt something press against his leg, something small, something warm, that his chest finally caved. The cub. The tiny bear pressed its head against Bryce's shin, its little body trembling, exhausted, afraid. And Atlas. Atlas watched. The bear, massive, scarred, alive, studied Bryce, his deep eyes searching. Not for doubt, not for weakness, but for understanding. And Bryce gave it to him, because they were the same. Both of them, fathers to something that had been left alone, protectors to something that deserved to live. Bryce knelt, his breath shaking, his fingers hesitating for only a moment before brushing against the cub's small head. His voice, barely above a whisper, cracked. "You're safe." The cub let out the softest sound. And then, to Bryce's absolute wreckage, Atlas moved closer. Not to protect, not to fight, but to trust. The bear, wild, untamed, something that did not belong to men, lowered his massive head and pressed his forehead against Bryce's. The weight of it, the warmth of it, the meaning of it, everything inside Bryce shattered. Because in that moment, they weren't just man and beast. They were something more, and the world had changed. Some moments are meant to be forgotten. Some stories aren't meant to be left untold. If this moment, this fight, this connection, moved something inside you, don't let it fade. Be part of something bigger. Join us at Wilderness Untold, where stories like this live on. Because this matters. The cold pressed in. The cub, warm against Bryce's side, let out a tiny, sleepy sigh. Atlas exhaled slow, deep. The fight was over. For now. But beyond the trees, far beyond the silence, something else was coming. The air was razor-thin, the kind of cold that cuts straight through muscle and settled into bone. The sky stretched endlessly above, a bruised, starless expanse of black, pressing down with a weight that felt unnatural. The silence was absolute. No wind, no distant crack of shifting ice, no breath of the trees. Bryce Callahan knew what that meant. Something was wrong. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs, steady but loud. Too loud. It shouldn't have been this quiet. Not here. Not after everything. Atlas felt it. The bear stood just ahead, his massive form a shadow against the endless white. His breath curled into the frozen air in slow, steady bursts. His muscles were coiled, his ears flicked back, listening. His cub, small, fragile, alive, was tucked close to his leg, pressed against the warmth of his father's body. Bryce exhaled slowly, trying to steady the storm inside his chest. He should have felt relief. They had survived the last fight. They had driven Garrison and his men back into the wilderness. For now. But this wasn't over. It never was. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he stepped forward, slow and careful. His breath was shallow, measured. He adjusted the grip on his rifle, but he didn't raise it. Not yet. Atlas turned his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting Bryce's. And in them, Bryce saw it. Not fear, not rage, but certainty. Atlas knew. Bryce felt his throat tighten. His fingers clenched against the rifle stock. Every instinct in him screamed, "Move." Now. Then it came. A sound. Sharp, unnatural, splitting through the cold like a jagged blade. A gunshot. Bryce's body moved before his mind could catch up. He lunged forward, shoving himself into the snow, reaching for the cub, his hands grabbing at the small, trembling body, shielding it with his own. The explosion of sound cracked through the air, bouncing off the trees, rolling through the valley like thunder. Atlas roared. It wasn't just a sound. It was something older, something deeper, a sound that made the mountains feel smaller, that made the stars retreat, that turned blood to ice. A warning, a promise. Bryce barely had time to suck in another breath before the next shot rang out. This one hit closer. Too close. The trees exploded with splintered wood. They were pinned. Atlas shifted, his massive body stepping over Bryce and the cub, his breath heavy, wild. His ears flattened against his skull, his head low. Defending. Bryce's mind was racing, calculating. 3 men, maybe 4, moving fast. They weren't hunting anymore. This was an execution. Bryce's teeth clenched, rage burning through his exhaustion. He could see it now, just beyond the tree line. Shadows shifting, figures moving between the trunks. Garrison, that son of a bitch. Bryce's hands tightened around the cub, shielding it as best he could. The little bear's body trembled beneath his grip, its breath fast and shallow. Another shot. Atlas let out a deep, guttural growl, his muscles flexing, his massive frame shifting forward. Bryce saw it. The choice. Atlas wasn't just reacting. He was choosing. And Bryce knew what that choice was. No, Bryce breathed, scrambling forward, his voice sharp, desperate. No, damn it, don't. But Atlas didn't stop. He stepped forward. He wasn't running. He was standing his ground. Bryce could feel his pulse hammering in his ears, his breath tearing from his lungs in ragged bursts. His hands clenched around the cub as he forced himself to move, to push up from the snow. Garrison's voice rang out through the trees. That's real stupid, Callahan. Bryce turned, his rifle finally lifting. Garrison stood at the edge of the clearing, his rifle slung lazily in his grip, but his finger rested against the trigger. 2 more men flanked him, their own weapons raised. Atlas let out another low growl. Bryce's breath shook. His voice was steady. You should leave. Garrison chuckled, his head tilting slightly. You don't give orders out here. Bryce's jaw clenched. Garrison's eyes flicked to Atlas, to the cub, then back to Bryce. And he smiled. That slow, cruel smile. You're protecting something that ain't yours, Garrison said. And you know how this ends. Bryce's grip on the rifle tightened. His body was a live wire, pulsing with energy that had nowhere to go. He saw Atlas shift beside him, saw the tension ripple through the bear's muscles. Atlas was waiting, waiting for Bryce. And Bryce knew. This wasn't just a fight. This was a decision. The line between what he had been and what he was becoming. Bryce took a slow step forward, his breath burning in the frozen air. You don't belong here, he said. Garrison's smirk widened. That's so. Bryce exhaled. Then he lowered his rifle, not in surrender, but in something stronger. You already lost, Bryce said. Garrison's smile faded. His fingers twitched on the trigger. And then Atlas moved. Not forward, not back, but around, between Bryce and the cub, between them all. It was a declaration. And Garrison saw it. Bryce saw it in the way the man's eyes flickered. The hesitation, the realization. This wasn't a bear anymore. This was something more. Garrison's lips pressed together. Then, slowly, he took a step back. One of his men shifted beside him. Boss. Garrison didn't look away from Bryce. Then he smiled. Not today, he murmured. And just like that, they were gone, slipping into the trees, like ghosts. The silence that followed was deafening. Bryce's breath came slow, heavy. The cub was still pressed against him, trembling, but alive. Atlas exhaled, and for the first time, Bryce saw him relax. The great bear let out a slow breath, his massive head lowering, not in exhaustion, but in relief. Bryce swallowed hard. His hand, shaking, raw, reached out, and Atlas let him. Their eyes met, and Bryce knew. Something had changed. Not just in the fight, not just in the woods, but inside him. Some stories don't just happen. Some change you. If you've ever felt the power of a moment like this, the kind that leaves a mark, then you understand why these stories matter. Don't let them be forgotten. Subscribe to Wilderness Untold, because these stories need to be told. The wind shifted. The cub, small but stronger than before, looked up at its father. Atlas nudged it gently, and together, they turned toward home. But Bryce knew this wasn't over. Something was still out there, and it was watching. The snow was falling again, soft, relentless. as if the earth itself was trying to cover the scars of what had been done here. But some wounds, some battles, could never be buried. Bryce Callahan's breath tore from his chest, ragged and burning in the frozen air. Blood, painted the snow at his feet, seeping into the earth like the wilderness itself was swallowing his pain. His fingers trembled around the cold steel of his rifle, but he wasn't aiming. He wasn't firing, because it wasn't the rifle that mattered anymore. It was Atlas. The bear, his bear, was on the ground. The great beast's massive chest heaved with labored, broken breaths. Steam rose from his fur, where blood, so much blood, ran dark and hot against the winter's pale skin. His enormous body, once a monument of power, lay still, save for the shallow rise and fall of his ribs. But his eyes, those dark, ancient eyes, were open, and they were on Bryce. The world around them was a chaos of ruin, trees shattered by bullets, the earth torn by tracks and violence. And beyond, at the edge of it all, Garrison. The hunter's rifle was still smoking from the shot that had brought Atlas to the ground. His lips, cracked and cold, pulled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Looks like the king finally falls," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness. Bryce's chest heaved. His voice, raw and trembling with something breaking, came through his teeth. "You bastard." But his voice caught, because behind him, a sound, a soft, frightened whimper. The cub, small, alone. And Bryce felt his heart tear wide open, because the cub wasn't running. The cub was crawling toward Atlas. The little creature's paws, clumsy and weak, dragged through the blood-soaked snow, its tiny chest heaving with fear, with exhaustion. But it kept moving. It didn't understand the danger, didn't understand the man with the rifle, didn't understand that the world had decided it shouldn't survive. All it knew, all it wanted, was to reach its father. Bryce's throat closed, his vision burning, because he saw it, not with his eyes, but with his soul. That cry, that desperation, that was him, the child that had been left behind, the boy who had stood in the rubble of a life torn apart, screaming for a father who would never come back. The boy who had learned that the world could be merciless. And then Atlas, with strength that should have been gone, with a body that should have been broken, moved. His paw, massive, trembling, shifted through the snow, toward the cub. It was the smallest motion, but it said everything. Bryce's body broke. The rifle hit the snow, forgotten. His knees followed. And his voice, his voice, ripped from him, not as a command, but as something raw. "Stay." His hand, shaking, bloodied, pressed to Atlas's massive side. He felt the bear's chest, rising, falling, slowing. Too slow, too shallow. Atlas's eyes, those deep, endless eyes, met his. And Bryce felt it, a passing, not of life, but of trust. "No." Bryce's voice cracked. "No, don't you dare." His chest seized, and he pressed harder, useless, desperate. "Not here. Not now." His voice broke, because he couldn't lose this. Not him. Not after everything. "I can't." His voice shattered, and his forehead dropped against the bear's thick fur. His body shook, and the words fell from him, words that he hadn't spoken since he was a boy. "Please." The word, small, fragile, broke the world. The cub, so small, so helpless, pressed itself against its father's body. And Atlas breathed, shallow, painful, but he stayed. Bryce's body caved, his hand pressing against Atlas's massive paw, and his voice, shaking, wrecked, spilled out. "I'm here." The bear's eyes, heavy, slow, closed. But he did not leave, because he wasn't alone. If you felt this, if you've ever known what it means to fight for something that cannot speak, that cannot ask, but matters more than anything, then you understand why stories like this can't be forgotten. Join us at Wilderness Untold, because some stories deserve to be felt. The wind shifted. Garrison's voice, cold and sharp, cut through the ruin. What's it going to be, Callahan? Bryce's body, slow and shaking, rose from the snow. But something inside him was different, because he wasn't standing alone. Atlas was still breathing. The cub was still here. And Bryce. Bryce wasn't a soldier, wasn't a hunter. He was something else now. His voice, low and steady, carried through the trees. It's over. But Garrison's smirk twisted, his rifle rising. No. Bryce's voice broke. And then the forest moved. Not Bryce. Not Atlas. But everything. The wind roared through the trees. The earth trembled. And from the shadows came others. Bears. The wilderness itself. And Bryce felt it. The wild. Not as something to fear, but as something alive. And it was answering. Garrison's smirk faltered. His rifle wavered. And then he ran. The silence returned. But it was a different silence. Not the silence of death. The silence of something greater. Bryce, bloodied, shaking, sank back to his knees. His hand found Atlas's fur. The bear's chest, slow, ragged, still moved. The cub, so small, pressed against him. And Bryce's voice, raw and broken, fell into the wind. You're safe. The wilderness did not belong to men. It belonged to those who protect. And some stories are everything. If you felt that, if you know why this matters, don't let it end. Subscribe to Wilderness Untold, because some stories should never die. The snow kept falling. Atlas stayed. The cub lived. And Bryce was not alone. Not anymore. But the wild is never done. And something unseen was waiting.